Today I'm really excited to be shooting here in Monument Valley, part of the great state of Utah. This is a location that I've seen photos of since I was a kid, and it's somewhere that I've wanted to visit for a very long time. As you can probably see, framed behind me are those three beautiful spires that you see in so many photographs all over the world. It doesn't matter where you go. If you talk about the American West or see the American West in a book, you're going to see these three spires, much like the vantage point that we're standing on right now. I've never actually been here before, and we arrived about 2 hours ago, so I had to scramble to try to find a unique vantage point. Now, it was interesting when we were researching this location, I had read that this main viewpoint that you see, if you Google Monument Valley, was actually from the Tourist Information Center, but it turns out that this view is actually from a hotel. In fact, I'm a little bit lower. I'm trying to do something a little bit different than what's typically done. But just behind me, if you were to take a look, I can see a ridge and I see a bunch of people, a few dozen people up there taking photos. There's a couple people doing selfies like this on a few of the rocks up there. That's actually a hotel. The hotel is called The View Hotel. And I have to admit, it definitely has the view of Monument Valley. The main thing that I wanted to do with this shot, instead of just getting the classic spire shot with nice clouds behind it, I wanted to do something a little bit different and incorporate the road. And I like the way that the road kind of bends through the frame, but from all the way up top, I didn't feel like it was really a big element. So I decided to hike down here, and there's all these great little outcroppings where it's really easy to set up a tripod because I wanted to actually be closer to the road. I don't want this to just be the standard sunset shot. What I'm going to do is treat this as a twilight shot instead. And while I'm treating it like a twilight shot, that gives me the opportunity to do something that I really like to do in my photography, and that's incorporating light trails. So right now there is a road behind me. This is the scenic highway that takes you all the way through Monument Valley and around these spires. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wait till it gets a little bit darker. I'm going to shoot, get the beautiful twilight, hopefully some color in the sky. When it gets a little bit darker, I'm going to wait for some cars to go by and add the trails. My original plan for this was to shoot this vantage point with the three spires with stars, but as you can probably see behind me, I have some beautiful clouds. So obviously, beautiful clouds are awesome too. So I don't know what's going to happen. The sky could clear, I could get color, but either way, I'm going to shoot it at twilight and incorporate the light trails from the cars. If the sky opens up enough, then I may start doing some astrophotography. So right now you guys are kind of seeing me in my natural element. I've never been here. It's my first day here. It's the only night that I have to shoot this before we move on to the next location. I'm going to be honest with you guys through this entire shooting process, and I'm going to let you know if it's something that I intended to do or if it's something that I sort of figured out on the fly. One thing you guys might notice here is I have two cameras set up. Now that's not out of the ordinary for me, but let me go ahead and explain what I have going on. First thing you'll probably notice is this camera right here, the GFX50S, is oriented in a vertical portrait mode, while this one is horizontal here in landscape mode. That's the Fujifilm X Pro 2. Well, why did I decide to set up two cameras? Well, there's a couple reasons. With a situation like this, if I do get stars, the vertical shot is going to look really good. If I don't get stars, a wider shot that sort of crops it a little bit more wide is going to look good because I don't have to rely on there being enough sky to fill the frame. But here is the other part of this equation. That is the new Fujifilm GFX50S. By the time this tutorial comes out, this prototype lens that I'm using is also going to hit the market. This is the 23mm f4. Now, at full frame equivalent, that's actually 18 millimeter. And I've actually been hired by Fujifilm to shoot promotional images for that lens. So everything I'm trying to shoot with this camera on this entire trip is fixed at 18 millimeters. So when I came out here, I thought, you know, most of my research was somewhere between 28 and 35, but maybe there's a good way to do a 4x3 aspect in landscape mode that's going to work. But when I started scouting here, I walked around all this whole area for about an hour, and I couldn't find anything that I liked at 18 millimeter. It turns out for a wide shot, this one is about 28 to 29 millimeter based on my calculations because it's APS-C. So let's just say it's about 28 millimeter, and I like the framing. This one wide at 18 was too wide. I couldn't get anything in the foreground that I really liked, so I decided to go vertical instead. While we arrived here 2.5 hours before sunset, I thought that was going to be plenty of time to capture the golden landscape, but unfortunately, we had a lot of shadow crawl. So this viewing area for Monument Valley, where this area is casting shadows on this landscape. And as we've been filming this introduction, you guys have probably been seeing how the shadows are crawling up the spires themselves. So take a look at this first shot. Notice how those shadows are super, super harsh. Well, those shadows continue to crawl across the frame. Take a look at this sequence of images. Notice how that shadow gets rougher and rougher and rougher and just moves through the frame. It's just not usable at all. So to get the entire landscape with even light, I would have had to have been here 4 hours before sunset, so I didn't have enough time. But check out this image that I shot here. Now, that's already starting to look pretty good. Now, by itself, it looks a little diffuse. It doesn't have a lot of dimension, but notice those hard shadows are gone. And that's because the sun actually went behind the clouds and the clouds filtered the light. Now again, while that flat-looking diffuse light shot is definitely better than those hard, ugly shadows, it's not exactly how I want this image to look. Right now, everything's looking really soft. The sun's going down in 5 minutes, and my hope was that this cloud line would break and I'd get strong light or beautiful golden light on just the tips of those spires. I thought that was going to be great. And then I could use that and blend that with a more twilight shot, maybe with some stars later. So right now, to be honest, I'm kind of building this as I go. I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to get any more light on these spires. I doubt it because the sunset's in 10 minutes, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get any more color in the sky. While I've been doing this interview, since we're trying to race as the sun's going down, because you guys know how hard it is for us to light this stuff in the dark, I've actually had these cameras both shooting in an interval timer mode. Now this is a low dynamic range scene, meaning that I'm not shooting any exposure bracketing. So I'm using my interval timer mode. This whole time I've been talking, it's been set to shoot an image every 20 seconds because the light continuously and constantly changes as the sun moves between those clouds. So every 20 seconds it's been taking a shot, and the settings for the cameras actually mirror each other. They are f8 aperture priority and the lowest ISO possible for the cameras. So on this one, the Fujifilm X Pro 2, that's an ISO of 200. On the GFX 50S, that's an ISO of 100. So they've just been shooting through. Also, while I've been teaching this lesson, I've been noticing a lot of cars have been driving back and forth, so I have a good feeling that there's still a lot of people out there. I see a lot of people at a viewpoint way down in the distance. Eventually, these guys have to pass back through on their way back home or to this hotel up here. So I'm hoping there's going to be enough cars down there for me to do longer exposures, hopefully 15 or 30-second exposures when it gets full dark outside to get the light trails. If that doesn't work, I'm going to have Lee or Patrick drive our rental car back and forth as many times as I need to be able to capture the trails. Right now, I haven't looked at my phone for a while, but I think the sun has already set below the horizon, so I don't think there's going to be any more light on this landscape at all. In fact, from now, it's going to start to get worse. But hopefully, as it starts to get worse on the landscape side, the sky starts to illuminate with some stars. So obviously there are way too many clouds for me to be able to do star trails. So this time I'm actually going to rely on a mixture of clouds and stars. But before that happens, let's take a look at the image straight out of camera of what the scene looks like right now. So just as I said, no more light on the environment at all. You can see it's really flat, much like those shots that I showed you earlier when it was diffuse behind the clouds. But this is a good example. This is usually when I would take my control image for an astrophotography shot anyway. So while there are clouds in the sky, I don't know if they're going to clear up. I don't know if the stars are going to mix well with the clouds. But now is the great opportunity for me to be able to capture a solid frame, evenly lit before twilight, after sunset, with strong settings. And what I mean by strong settings is the settings like f8, f11, lowest ISO possible, even if you have to do an exposure of 30 seconds. As soon as I start trying to capture the stars, I'm going to have to change my camera settings. I'm going to have to bring the f-stop down, and I'm going to have to bring the ISO up, and that's going to hurt the overall quality. So this, just like usual, if I have my controlled image established, then I can use that to blend back into the night shot. Now, I obviously came out here with a plan. I know I want the car trails going through the scene. I know I want to try to incorporate stars. I know I want to do something that's vertical and horizontal. I'm not sure what nature is going to do in the end, and I'm never sure how the elements are going to work out. So any way I can, I try to make sure I capture everything I might need to salvage a shot if my creative vision doesn't work out. In order for the car trails to look their best, it's easier to do it when it's full dark outside. That way you can do a 30-second exposure. The whole scene can be black and you can get just the trails themselves because you can put that into the frame in Photoshop using a simple blending mode, and we're going to cover all that in post-processing. But right now it also means that I can't shoot for probably another 30 minutes. I'm going to take a few shots every once in a while and I'm going to wait for it to get fully dark so that I can capture the trails from the cars, and hopefully at that time we'll also be able to find out if the stars in the sky are going to work as well. So I'm going to check back with you guys once it's a little darker out. All right, everybody, as you can see, it's fully dark outside, but I'm going to go ahead and explain exactly what happened. Shortly after I left you guys last time, it started to get full dark. The clouds started to stack up on the horizon and cause a really bad haze. So I wasn't too optimistic about the stars, but it was the perfect time because it was dark enough to capture the car trails. I didn't actually have to have Lee or Patrick drive because enough people were still leaving the park that I was able to get about 4 or 5 solid chances to capture the trails. So what I did first is I got my camera settings ready. I wanted to do 30-second exposures. And remember, I had the 2 cameras set up, so I have the X Pro 2 and I have the Fujifilm GFX 50S medium format. And once the cars came around the corner, I locked down the shutters and I was able to capture the trails. Now, usually if the car went fast, I was able to get the trail in one 30-second exposure. But those roads are really bad, so some of the cars would go real slow and kind of bump along. So sometimes it took 2 shots to be able to put it together. But it's going to be easy to put together in post-processing. The other thing I decided to do was, because the cars were actually having to be connected with 2 30-second exposures, I decided to reconfigure the camera settings in the GFX 50S to do a 1-minute exposure. Now, the medium format camera is really interesting because you can do up to a 60-minute exposure, a 1-hour exposure in camera. You don't have to have a lockable shutter release cable to do this. You can actually just go into the settings and set it. After 30, it'll go to 40, 50, 60, and then it'll double. So it'll go 60 to 2 minutes, 4, 8, 15, 30, and 60. So I was able to set it to 1 minute and get one continuous car trail. So with everything that I captured so far, I should be able to blend a good frame in that's just before sunset with a little bit of the pink light on the spires themselves, soft light on the foreground, maybe darkened up a little bit to add the trails. Right now, I'm not really sure. I have not been able to look at these on the screen in Photoshop yet, so we're going to have to do that in post-processing when we make that call. But something interesting happened. When I started messing with the Fujifilm GFX 50S, and I was already shooting an exposure of 1 minute, I kind of got an idea, well, if there's a bunch of clouds in the sky, it's kind of hazy, what would happen if I shot a 30-minute exposure? Now, every time we've done star trails together, you know that I like to do 30-second exposures and stack them together. Well, what if you did something different? What if you shot a 10, 20, or 30-minute exposure? Well, you're definitely going to have the movement of the stars, so it's going to capture the star trails. But the problem is it's going to be one exposure, meaning that anything can happen. If somebody flashes a light on the camera, it's done. You're out 30 minutes. Plus, even if you get the star trails, you can't have the tails fade. So you can't change the opacity of the trail itself. It's just going to be static. What you shoot, what you see is what you get. So I'd already been shooting at 1 minute to capture the car trails, so I decided to test 2 minutes. And at 2 minutes, I was shooting at f4 and ISO 1600. After I shot that and everything looked good, everything was exposed correctly, I decided to calculate what it would take to shoot a 30-minute exposure, and it turned out to get a 30-minute exposure, I just needed to change the ISO to 100. So I thought it was pretty cool. I can shoot ISO 100 at night at f4 at 30 minutes. Well, I have to admit, I am pleasantly surprised with that 30-minute exposure, and I think since that worked, I might as well push it all the way to the limit of the in-camera processing to do a 60-minute exposure. So I'm going to run back over to the camera and I'm going to readjust the settings. So right now at 30 minutes, it's ISO 100 at f4. So what I'm going to need to do to make it 60 minutes is change f4 to 5.6. So I'm going to set that, shoot, and I have no idea how it's going to come out, but once we get back into post-processing, I'll show you guys everything, and you can be the judge of whether this technique for long exposure at night is better with one continuous exposure or a bunch of consecutive shorter ones. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. It's time to get started editing the photos we captured in Monument Valley. First, let's take a look at everything that I captured. I had those cameras basically set on an interval, so I think I captured way too many images. In this case, with the GFX 280 and with the X Pro 2, 241. So we need to bake that down into one moment in time and one perspective. First of all, let's take a look at the horizontal or landscape-oriented X Pro 2 and just kind of take a look at everything that I shot. So if I just kind of roll through these, you can see we had some cloudy activity coming into that light. And this is what I was talking about, that light crawl that we saw in the scene and the traffic going by. So none of these images are going to work. But I've actually highlighted here on the bottom of the screen, you can see I've highlighted some raw files. And as I start to go forward in time, you can see that that light starts to fade, creeps down the back of the valley, and the spires are still getting a little bit of light. This is the advantage of having a semi-cloudy sky or a partly cloudy sky. So we have a little bit of light, and you can see that it gets nice, 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 and then the sky starts to light up. So this is the one that I arrived on. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but first let's go ahead and take a look at the vertical version of this. So this is a completely different feel for these images. And actually, if I take a look at one of these, as opposed to the landscape-oriented one, this one, if you can remember from the in the field portion, was just in case I was able to do some astrophotography. And I do have a few shots to show you guys of what I attempted to do on a cloudy night sky, but for the most part, this is going to end up being just a shot that's near sunset. So we're looking for sort of a golden hour, colorful sky, nice clouds kind of situation. But we first have to decide if we like this vertical version or from the X Pro 2, this landscape version. And given the choice here, since if we actually go forward in time here to where it starts to get nice, we have a nice amount of sky texture going on, some clouds, the road moves through the frame. I think that this landscape-oriented shot is going to work better than this portrait or vertical oriented shot, just because we're not going to do any astrophotography with this. We're not going to be focusing on the sky. And in this case, if we take a look at this image, we can see those three iconic spires, but they're not really the main feature. Going back to this version, you can see that those spires are front and center, not exactly center, slightly off-center from center, but still a main feature of this shot. So let's take a look at this together. So what I did is I selected, after we got past this light crawl, you can see that that light crawls up and then we start to get this soft light. Cars keep moving by, but I settled on this shot in particular. But if we actually take a look at these, if I start way back here, we can see how that light actually changes. So we see that soft light leaving the spires, and as I move forward in time, every 20 or 30 seconds or so, you can see that that heats up a little bit, but as we move forward in time, it starts to fade. But as we start to go forward, that ambient light starts to pick up. And at this point, I really like the ambient light in the environment here. So what I can do is just move forward a little bit and see if the sky improves. And for the most part, it stays the same until about here. We get a little bit of pink on the bottom left and the bottom right, but otherwise the sky turns almost to a blue hour. So I don't like this. If I move forward in time, you can see that the sky gets more and more flat. If we had a partial Milky Way or some stars or something like that, this could be a good sky to start using that because we start to see some of the stars. But it got completely cloudy at the end of the night. So backing that up a little bit, any of these here, and I'd say back to about this point, what I'm looking for is some white in the sky here, these white little clouds, some blue, we have a little bit of pink on the left, and some orange and yellow on the right. So I've pretty much settled on this one here, but any of these are fine. You can see we have a lonely vehicle, pretty easy to get rid of in Photoshop. So this is going to be the base that we're going to use. And the next thing that we're going to do is actually bring in the light trails. So at the end of the shoot, before what I was hoping was going to be a nice astrophotography session, I actually started shooting, and I've selected a few of these light trails. And I shot quite a few, but I've actually selected 4 for us to use here. And that's this main one right here. You can see that's most of it. What I really like about this is it's actually illuminating part of the background as well. So you can see that it's illuminating some of these rocks. This should look pretty nice. Moving forward, here's that back portion because I was doing 30-second exposures. Here's another one. Kind of like that this is just kind of a solo trail. We'll see how that looks. And another one here that's just a little thicker. So we'll go ahead and take a look at all those together. But before we move to the student file, the lesson files that are incorporated with this lesson in particular, let's look at the end of the night. I click on the GFX 50S. Now bear in mind, these are not included in the lesson files because we're not actually going to be working on them. I just want to show you what I ended up shooting. As we started to get to the end, you can see that this, extremely dark, let's go to develop, and we'll just pull the exposure up a little bit so we can start to see what's going on. This is a 120-second exposure native in camera. When I say native in camera, the GFX 50S by Fujifilm allows me to just set the camera in its T mode, which is basically its timer or manual mode, to set exposures with a longer duration than just 30 seconds. If you have a Nikon or a Canon, or most cameras in general, in camera with manual mode, we're locked to 30 seconds. We have to use a timer or a trigger release to do a longer exposure. With this particular camera, I can actually set it to be 30 seconds, 60, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 15, 30, and actually 1 hour inside of camera. So here, I've started to just test it. Here's when we actually had the potential of maybe having star trails. You can see zooming in here, and it looks pretty nice for a 2-minute exposure. But as it started to cloud up, I wanted to try something else. I'd never tested this in the camera before. So here, and I'll expose this one a little bit more too, this is a 30-minute exposure. So if I roll up here, it's 1,800 seconds, which is pretty cool. And you can see how it's cloudy. And when it's cloudy with the star trails, you can see that those stars are going in and out of the clouds. So I tested a 30-minute exposure. I might as well have tested the 60-minute exposure, the 1 hour exposure as well. So this is the 1 hour exposure. So let me go ahead and ramp that up here. And you can see that's 1 hour of the shutter on the camera being open. And I'm getting these long trails. That's how much the stars moved in 1 hour. Now, as a whole, this is actually pretty good. You can see the moon rising. If I zoom in, there are a couple hot pixels, but considering that the shutter was open for 1 hour, that's actually pretty extraordinary. Now, while it is extraordinary for a camera to be able to do that, it's not exactly portfolio level work. In all the previous tutorials, when we've done star trails, we've shot 30-second exposures so that we can combine them together and then also create a nice trail or a tail like a comet fade on these stars. If you leave the shutter open for an hour, then you're going to be stuck with the stars that you get. Plus, there's a lot of noise, and I don't like that they're broken up this time. So we do have a lesson coming up in the future. We're going to address the 30-second exposures and actually make a beautiful star trail scene. But for now, let's keep Monument Valley just to the golden hour and sunset. Now it's time to go ahead and open the lesson file associated with this. This is going to be Lesson 2, Monument Valley. We'll go ahead and open Lightroom together. All right, so here we are in Lightroom, and here are the files that I've included. I've included the main scene that we talked about, and also the 4 light trail scenes as well that we're going to combine together into one seamless image. But before I get started, I don't know if you guys can kind of tell. If we take a look at this, it looks like my camera wasn't exactly level. It looks like it's kind of rotated a little bit counterclockwise. So let's take care of a few settings right off the bat here. And the first thing is, let's go ahead and remove the sharpening. We'll remove the noise reduction that Lightroom puts on automatically. And I'm also going to go down and transform it. Let's see what Lightroom has to say. If I actually roll over this and just click on level, yeah, actually that corrected it. Now you can see from off to level. Do that one more time, off and level. If it didn't seem obvious before, it seems really obvious now. So that took care of that situation. Now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and copy those settings, and I can just pick the ones that we use. Transform, we use noise reduction and sharpening. Copy, select the other 4 here, and develop settings. Paste settings. One thing that I'm going to do that's a little bit different, I usually do this at the end, but I'm just going to go ahead and bring this base layer into Photoshop now. So I'm just going to say export with previous. Same settings I used in the last lesson. That's going to be a PSD ProPhoto RGB at 300 DPI. So we're going to call this Original Raw. Perfect. Head back to Lightroom really quick. And now let's start talking about the scene itself. I'd say that this is a really nice image, but it's looking kind of flat, so we're obviously going to make some adjustments. But first, I want to talk a little bit about color profiles. Adobe more recently has moved this profiling to the top, and I've selected some of my favorites here. But if you're new to this, it's actually pretty cool. You can load this section here, and it's actually going to take you out of a list view, and it's going to show all of the different things. So it's all of the different things that you can use. I've actually created some favorites. Well, I haven't created them, but I've selected them to be my favorites just by starring something like this. So if you like it, you can star it. It'll end up in the favorites and outside of this list view. So here you can actually roll over different preset color profiles. So for example, Camera Provia Standard is actually the standard format for Fujifilm cameras, and it's the one that I use. So looking at the back of the camera, every time I shoot, the JPEG preview or the JPEG itself will show Provia, so we can actually check these. And obviously there's some really beautiful black and white ones, legacy ones, and then anything else that you actually load into here will be available. So I've went ahead and starred a few of them. Let's close this and just talk about them. By default, and the one that I usually will be using, is Adobe Color, but sometimes I want to add a little bit more pop to the landscape by readdressing the color profiling. And I can do that just by changing it, for example, to Adobe Landscape. And you can see Adobe Landscape gives it a little bit more pop, contrast, and saturation. And you go back to color, a little bit more flat. Landscape is going to be a little bit more punch. But if I go to Vivid, Vivid's going to be a little bit more contrasty. Same thing on the Fujifilm side. We have Provia, which is standard, which looks pretty good, which is a little bit more contrasty than the Adobe Color. From standard, we can go to Vivid, which is the Velvia. Velvia is going to be highly saturated and really crisp. So I don't like to go all the way forward too saturated. I'm actually going to pick Adobe Landscape for this situation because it's going to give us a nice baseline to work with. Something else to point out too is usually with these, like Provia for example, this is what I'm shooting. So on the back of my camera, I can see this. I look through the viewfinder, it's mirrorless, an electronic viewfinder. I can see this effect. If I change it to Velvia or Vivid, sometimes it looks better in the field. I get an idea what it's going to look like when it's finished. Those reds and blues and yellows, everything's just popping right out of the viewfinder and it looks really good. But often that's not what I'm editing in. And the reason is on the back of the camera when you're in the field and it's sunny out, you can get away with a lot more. You can push those colors in a post-process or a JPEG processing really far. And when you get back to the computer, everything looks a little bit too much. So on the computer, I tend to roll it back a little bit. And the other nice thing about this is all of these camera profiles are non-linear and you can just shoot your raw file because even if you change them in camera, if you change your camera settings to Vivid or anything else like that, your raw file is not going to bake that color information into the raw. You can always come back here in Lightroom and change it to anything else. It will, however, bake all that information into your JPEGs. So whatever color profile you pick for your camera will permanently be baked into the JPEG file. So just keep that in mind. But in Lightroom, we can change it to anything we want. So let's leave it on Adobe Landscape for this lesson. Let's start by adjusting the exposure just a little bit. And I'm going to pick basically some even amounts. So I'm going to say a quarter stop. Let's do the same thing in the shadows here. Let's try to bring it up at about a quarter stop here. And then let's pull the highlights down. When I pulled the exposure up, you can see the highlights. I really want to get the sky back, so let's pull that way down. Something around 50 should work pretty well. So if I actually just reset this before and after, not a huge adjustment, but enough to just start to bring out these colors and also bring back the sky. So by bringing the detail in the foreground, by pushing the shadows up and making more of it become revealed, I also needed to pull back the highlights so that I can still keep all that detail in the sky. Also keep in mind that we are going to be putting light trails or car trails on this image, so I don't want to bring it up too much. I don't want it to be ridiculous and look like a midday shot because during the midday we wouldn't actually see those headlights or even those car trails. So I'm going to be really subtle with all the adjustments. So that's basically all I'm going to do. But what I want to do now is instead of doing these global settings like we did in the previous lesson only, I'm actually going to use some different selection tools as well, and that's going to be the elliptical selection and the gradient selection. So let's start with an elliptical selection. Now I'm setting this to invert because by default, Lightroom wants to select everything outside of my elliptical selection. I want to select everything inside. So in Adobe Lightroom language, that's inverted. Let's go ahead and select the mountains. Now I want the mountains selected, soft fall off. I want part of the sky and part of the landscape. What I'm actually going to do is start to simulate some soft light. By default, you can see my exposure is set to 1. You guys might have different settings here. It depends on the last thing or whatever your preference are set to. So I'm going to reset this to 0. First thing let's go ahead and bring the exposure up just a little bit to start simulating that light. Let's say 0.15 should be good. Let's do the same thing in the whites. You can see as I bring the whites up, that's really going to make it feel like this is illuminated. Too much, it's going to make it feel like this is a mask. We want it to be fairly natural. Next thing I want to do is address the color itself. Now that's going to manipulate the color of the spires and also the color of the background and the clouds. I essentially want to warm this up. Now since I've made a radial selection, it gives me the ability to tweak the white balance selectively instead of globally. So this is really powerful. Let's warm this up. You can see as I warm that up, that's too much. So let's roll that back. And let's also tint it so it's a little bit more into the magenta region. And we'll just keep this even right around 15 and 15. And now that looks pretty good actually. So I can move this and make adjustments so that the light fall off starts to hit some of the earth here and a little bit of the sky. So we have the spires and we have a little bit of light. Almost like that light behind us, that sun is kind of pushing through the clouds, using the clouds like a nice softbox and illuminating the tips of these spires a little bit more. It's exactly what I want. Now let's create another selection as a gradient. And this time I want to select the sky. Same thing here, but this time I'm going to start at the top and I'm going to click and drag, just like that. Now, it's really easy to do here. I want to select the entirety of the sky with a soft selection. If I show the selected mask overlay here, you can see everything that's magenta will be selected 100%. Everything that falls in from this point in the center to the bottom of this bounding box is going to be my fall off. So that's going to be 50% all the way down to 0% selected. So that looks pretty good for the selection. Well, what I want to do with the sky is first get rid of this overexposed thing, but I also want to create a little bit of drama in the sky, and I can do that by tweaking the dehaze. And you can see too much, and it's like an HDR nightmare, so don't do that. But if we start to work subtly, again, like 15 or 20%, something like that, something really subtle, it looks pretty good. Now dehaze, especially when we get into the really harsh realm of dehaze, actually adds quite a bit of contrast to the image, but it also sort of compresses the dark. So sometimes we have to adjust the shadows just to pick that up. So you can see those clouds changing there. If I pull this up to about 75% or 3/4 of a stop, that's going to prevent these clouds from getting any darker. So I'm trying to darken the rest of the sky, add contrast, but not make the darkest clouds darker than they already are. So that looks pretty good. The other thing that I want to do is add a little bit more of a shift into magenta in the sky here, and I can do that just by doing this. I can add a little bit more red to those clouds. If I increase this effect too much, it looks like I'm using a graduated filter of color, but just a little bit. Again, we're working in the 15 to 20% changes make a big difference just to start giving us a baseline for future editing. So it's going to go ahead and change the dynamic of that sky, make it a little bit more interesting, add some pinks, but not neutralize all the other colors that we have, those grays, whites, and blues. So a little bit in this case can go a long way. Close that out. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and export this as well. Export with previous. Of course, I've already done that, so let's go ahead and use unique names. Select all. You guys remember Command A, copy, Command C, Command W for close, Command V for paste. So we have the original RAW and the edited RAW. Let's go ahead and zoom in. You guys see anything distracting, any distracting elements? I don't know, maybe this car driving on this road, that would definitely be a distracting element. Let's go ahead and get rid of these now before they give us problems later. And I'm going to see if this works here. It should. Let's just go ahead and use the heal brush set to content aware and make that brush a little bit smaller. This should be really easy for Photoshop to figure out just by painting over that. And yeah, it looks pretty good. Let's just clean it up a little bit here on the edges. I'm not too worried about this color because we're going to cover this up with car trails. I just don't want there to be, a car sitting on top of that because it's going to ruin the effect. The other thing is I may want to sort of head up to the sky and to see if there's any sensor spots or dust spots. And sure enough, I usually have a dirty camera sensor, especially when I'm shooting in the desert, so we'll go ahead and get rid of those. Now, if this is going to your portfolio, if you're printing it, just make sure that there's nothing glaring in the background. I'd clean these cameras before we set off on the road together, so they should be pretty good. But now I know the X Pro 2 at least has one dust spot. No more cars, no people, nobody doing selfies. It looks actually pretty good, so we'll just back that up and move on to the next step. So we have this base level established. Pretty easy edit here. Let's go ahead and go to Lightroom and talk about the light trails themselves. So I have 1, 2, 3, and 4 of these. These don't need any editing at all. What I'm going to do is just select them all, export with previous. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and our raw file. So let's go ahead and select all here, copy, close, paste. We'll do that again really quickly. Copy, close, paste. Select this, copy, close, paste. Just do it one more time. Perfect. Next thing, we have all of these layers. They're not going to work the way that they're set right now. So when we're doing anything that needs to combine illumination, in other words, star trails or car lights, headlights, different things like that, we're going to use the blending mode called Lighten. A Lighten basically takes anything that's 51% gray to white, and it's going to go ahead and reveal that. Everything else that is 50% gray and below is actually just going to be knocked out or invisible. So if we go to the normal mode, you can see all of these dark pixels are going to be gone, and all that's going to be left is just the light areas here. They're going to sit right on top of the landscape. So for each one of these, I can actually just select them all, go to the Lighten blending mode, and we can see all of that put together, and we can see exactly how that all looks. And I can actually turn them on and off. We'll just go ahead and see. So this is the main one. Here's that extra little bridge over the back. You can see the car going over the back. These were the extra ones. You can see that there was a little bit of a gap here. So I picked that one so it kind of fills it in. And then if I turn this one on, you can see it fills in the rest. It really makes us feel like it's either one solid car moving through or multiple cars moving through. It's a good amount of light. I think it's the perfect amount of light for this scene. So with these, I can go ahead and select them, keep everything organized. We'll create a folder and we'll go ahead and call this light trails. Now, everything might look fine now, but there might be some things that are sort of sticking out here, like this in the background here. See this car way in the background? That's now part of the light trails. All of this here, if we didn't want to have the landscape illuminated, that's also part of the light trails. And we have to be really, really careful because these little things, hot pixels or little reflections of light because we're doing long exposures, those are actually going to show up as well. So we have to be really careful. So the trick here is we don't want to just use this as is. We're going to either have to go in with a mask, paint these things out, or what we can actually do is just reveal the area that we want. So in this case, if I black out this mask, and I can invert it, a great hotkey, Command-I for invert, and now what I can do is just with a brush, a white brush, I can just go ahead and paint in all of these areas that I want. That way, just in case there's hot pixels, just in case there's anything else, all of those things that I'm not going to notice because I'm not zooming in, this will just make sure that we remedy that so it's not a problem later. The worst thing is getting into final editing and realizing you could have fixed something very early in stages before you apply any additional editing. So now we have our light trails, nothing outside of that, and it looks pretty good. Let's zoom this to back a little bit so we can look at it in total. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more just so we have more screen real estate to use. And I think the trails look really nice. I still feel like this might be a little bit bright. So rather than going back to the raw, I can really quickly fix that by just adding an adjustment layer in between. And in this case, I'm going to use curves. And inside of this curves, we're just going to call this darken foreground. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and pull this down a little bit so you can see everything's darkening right now, but I just want to find an area where I think the foreground looks nice. So the more I pull this down, you can see the more that lighting is going to be intact. And I want that, but I don't want it to be too intense. This is a blend. So we'll pull it down to about there. Now, using the gradient tool, G on the keyboard, white to black, I can say I want that to be affected from here to here. If I hold shift, it's going to lock that perfectly for me, and you can see that I've faded that out. Might be a little bit more dramatic than I want. Let's go ahead and extend that a little bit, and you can see now I get that darkening there. And at any point on this layer, I can actually just go in and manipulate that. So we'll pull it down a little bit. Now the nice thing is doing this on an adjustment layer rather than going back to Lightroom and doing it in the raw file, it's easier to adjust later. If I were to create a gradient selection inside of Lightroom, darken this whole foreground, and then a couple hours later in editing decide that I don't want it, at that point it's kind of difficult to go back if I've already duplicated that layer, added additional effects and different things like that. So with a adjustment layer, I can just say, you know what, that was too much. Let me just go ahead and roll it back or just turn it off entirely. So it's tremendously powerful for nonlinear editing. Now I feel like this is a pretty easy image because all of the colors were already there. We haven't had to push it too far, and we added the trails. We gave it a little bit more, something extra. But now it's time to really address the lighting. So right now we created that nice lighting in the center inside of Lightroom. We've moved these light trails. But what I actually need to do is address some of the lighting around this area, because right now you can see I get these nice pools of light. That looks really natural, but around here I feel like it should be illuminating the landscape just a little bit more. So we're going to go ahead and create another dodge and burn layer by holding the Option key and clicking the Make New Layer button. From there, we'll set the mode to Overlay, fill with neutral 50% gray, and we'll call this Dodge Burn. Perfect. Just like the last lesson, we know that we can use a brush. I'm going to change that to like 3%. Again, I'm very heavy-handed with these stylists, or styli, they would say. So let me go ahead and start to paint this. So right now, with white, I can go ahead and accentuate. You can see as I paint, it's going to re-illuminate around those edges so it doesn't look as drastic, and just kind of pull this landscape in. Down here as well, this is really fun. Zoom out just a hair. Make the brush a little bit larger. You can see I can start to extend that lighting all the way back into the scene. This looks really nice. So I'm just going to follow this edge all the way around as if the light was creeping past the edge here and closer into the foreground to make it look a little bit more realistic. Same thing here around this area and definitely around here. So we're just going to pull that up. This will also sit above our curves layer where we did this and pulled the darkness down. So this is going to sit right above and mitigate some of that. I might also want to bring back some of the background, maybe here, just a little bit, accentuating some of this area back here that looks like it would pick up a little bit more lighting because it's a lighter clay or lighter earth back there. That looks pretty good. So here we go. And if I toggle this on and off, yeah, that's starting to look pretty nice. Might be a little bit better to go dramatic, more dramatic, more dramatic. Nice. Now, let's go ahead and do a little bit more. Now we can start talking about detail. This is the foreground, so we can actually start talking about detail here, just like on these rocks. So maybe some of these highlights are getting picked up and accentuated along the rocks here. So just along there, giving this part of the image just a little bit more life, a little bit more character. Some of these little shrubs, these bushes, little things like that. So the top of this hill, a little bit lighter, this area, but especially these rocks and sort of this ridge line. Perfect. Let's go ahead and zoom out and take a look. Yeah, that's actually looking pretty good. And we could go, and if you wanted to be really dramatic, I don't usually like doing this, but if you have something that really wants or needs strong leading lines, you can actually paint towards edges like this. Leaving, if you were to paint dark, you could actually paint dark and actually have this look like there were tendrils of light moving in the scene. I don't want to be that distracting with this. Overall, I'm just trying to lighten some of these areas because I can come back to this dark and foreground element here and pull it down a little bit more. Now, this is going to be a little adjustment. If you select this, just by clicking on it, you can use the arrow keys just to change at one point. So we can go down a few points here, darken that a little bit more, and then you can see that this dodge and burn layer is going to be even more intense. Oh, it looks pretty nice, and we can really clean that up. So it looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and reset that to the center of the screen. So we have the dodge and the burn. Overall, I feel this image is coming along really nicely, but it only needs one more thing in my opinion, and that's one final color correction to bring it all together. And that's a color correction on top of everything, with the lights and the background together. Let's turn off the dodge and the burn, and let's use that hotkey for create new layer out of everything. Shift, Option, Command, E. And that's going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this ACRF for Adobe Camera Raw Filter, and I'm going to go up here to the filter menu, Camera Raw Filter. I feel overall it's a little bit dark, so let's just go ahead and make a small adjustment there. Let's pull up the shadows just a little bit, and by doing that, let's also pull the highlights down just a little bit. So we're just going to go ahead and bring that sky drama back just a little bit, because if we go too far forward in exposure, you can see that it's going to blow out that sky. So we have to pull the highlights back just a little bit to compensate. Now the last thing that I want to do here is very easy, and that's just going to be some dehaze. So some global dehaze just to tie it all together. I'll go really subtle with that. So a little bit more exposure. We can actually probably go a tad more. Instead of 0.15, let's even go to 0.2 and pull the highlights down just a little bit more, something around -30. -31. Let's make it more of a rounded number at -30. And even the shadows will pull up just a little. Well, let's leave the shadows alone. I think the exposure really took care of that. So that looks pretty good with the dehaze and everything. Let's go ahead and apply that. And we'll take a look at the before and after here. We have the original and we have the adjusted version. So not a huge difference, but just enough to pull it all together, just enough to kind of bring all of those details back. Especially here in the sky, you can see the sky feels a little bit more dramatic. These colors are starting to pop, specifically these darker clouds, if you take a look at that before and after, in front of these lighter clouds. So it basically creates more of a three-dimensional sky by adding a little bit more contrast there, just to pull all of the contrast and details out so that they're all kind of speaking for themselves, and then we have that layering effect of dark clouds over light clouds over a blue sky. It looks pretty nice when it's all put together. Well, I have to admit, this lesson was much easier than the previous lesson because we didn't have any focus stacking or different blending things, but still, it came out really great. And what we started with is quite different from what we ended up with. Let's go ahead and take a look at the build. This is what we started with straight out of camera. We did a little bit of a rotational adjustment because it was off axis, so we had to rotate that a little bit. After that, just by changing the color profiling and editing, we actually had from here to here, which is a huge difference. We removed the car and the spot in the sky. Next thing we did is we added the light trails. We darkened up the foreground to bring those light trails in and really make them pop. Then we added the dodge and the burn. Then at the end, we added the Adobe Camera Raw filter just to brighten everything up and unify it together. So in the beginning, we ended up with this straight out of camera, and then in a few short minutes, we went from here to here. And I think that looks pretty good. Well, that wraps things up for Monument Valley. The next time I see you guys, we'll be back in the field exploring more areas of the American Southwest.